Hello everyone and welcome to this week's Blender add-on tutorial. This is going to be the first in this series where I teach you the super basics for beginners of creating a Blender add-on, which essentially is an extension or script kind of tool for Blender, which allows you to have a UI or interface or inject your code into any area of the interface of Blender and apply code, use images, UIs, etc. We're going to be showing you all about the built-in tools inside of Blender already that can help you get started scripting, building add-ons, and things like that. Yes, this channel mostly makes videos about Adobe add-ons, but we can kind of make add-ons for other programs using similar techniques to Adobe. As well, it's good to have more skills than just making add-ons for one brand of products. Plus, the future is probably in like 3D and VR and video game type things, so it's good to get a little bit into 3D programs. But before we get started, I do want to remind you down below, hit subscribe and the bell icon to be notified of new videos coming out twice weekly in the channel, and down in the description you can follow us on GitHub for coding updates as well as Instagram for other live updates. If you're not already a member of our Discord server, make sure you come and join to get up with scripting, extensions, plugins, some tutorial ideas, and much more. And if you'd like to help support us on YouTube, you can do so by becoming a member or supporter, and this comes with cool perks like loyalty badges, Discord status, member polls, member live streams, and also down below, check out the links to AE Scripts, Gumroad, and Adobe Exchange to see some other cool stuff I make. And just a hint for those of you who are actually listening to this, I believe I am planning on releasing a new product here within the next month or so. Just want to make sure it's ready so we don't have another disaster on our hands. And one other thing you'll notice, I am here on the left side of the screen. That's because a lot of the UI stuff is going to be appearing on the right side of our screen today. So that's going to be the best spot for us to be able to view it. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. If you haven't already, make sure you have Blender installed. If you don't know what Blender is, of course, it's a free 3D program that is completely open source, and within the past few years has been really keeping the level of professionalism, updates and things like that to a max, and keeping up with a lot of the more expensive 3D programs. And I've been using Blender since 2009. I don't know if I still have the tutorials on my channel, but I have a few older Blender tutorials about how to make 360 video in 360 and things like that. And that's kind of at the beginning of all of that when they were just coming out with VR headsets and stuff. So to see Blender grow like this is quite fun and super powerful. So add-ons. How are we going to get started making Blender add-ons? Of course, we need Blender installed. So once you launch Blender, you're probably going to see the default cube and all of these default panels. What you want to do, because Blender is so kind to us and provides all of these preset UI templates, is we can click on scripting. And yes, it is scripting in a sense, and we are writing add-ons, just to use the correct terminology. An add-on in the Adobe sphere can kind of be defined as a script, plugin, extension, or UXP plugin. In Blender, it kind of refers to anything that we have that does extra functionality. If you're familiar, under Edit, Preferences, all of the add-ons are accessible through here. You have the option to sort by where they appear, whether it's in the 3D view, if you want to add a mesh, if it's a camera type thing. You can sort them if they're community made or official. And eventually, if you ever distribute an add-on, this is where the user will install it, usually using something like a zip file or something like that, and then enable it in here. But for now, we're going to do everything from within Blender itself, because we can do a ton of useful testing inside of the program itself. So once you're inside of the scripting interface, the main things you'll see, you'll have a 3D view. I believe this is the default. It may have changed because I've been working with these for a bit, but you'll probably have a 3D view, a Python console, or just a console here, which is going to display a lot of useful information. If you can't see it, it looks something like this. And then I'm going to have to move the screen. Maybe we'll just put me in the center here. It'll be a unique tutorial. We have also this down here, which is part of our console, which contains like the actual description of what's happening. Anytime we run something, maybe I duplicate this cube, you can see the actual action it ran is going to appear inside of here. So if I wanted to, I could literally just take this code and paste it in my script or whatever, and it's going to have that functionality. give or take, we may need to customize a few things. And then we have the code editor, which is just the Blender text editor, which allows us to work on our Python script. And then, of course, on the right side here, we have all of our normal stuff. As you can see right now, I am in the Scene tab, and I have all of this information here with my layout demo. That's because by default, let's see, if your scripting tab and your code editor looks like this, if we go ahead and go to templates, here we have basically everything you need to get started learning add-ons. There are open shading language examples. These are basically preset shaders. If you're familiar with shaders, these are basically how you can create textures and different appearances and then apply these to vertices, faces, and things like that. But for the most part, what we want to be looking for is all of these Python templates. Inside of here, we have tons of useful stuff, everything ranging from actual functional scripts all the way up to UI scripts, which contain images or custom menus and stuff like that. And if you're a natural Blender user, you know that there are a lot of different UI options and different menu drop downs and things like that. A lot of them, yes, are kind of custom. For example, like these are indeed drop downs with kind of different stylings to them, but some of them have custom icons and things like that. You have things like this kind of menu here. If I press Z in my viewport, we have this nice, like, I believe this is called a flyout menu or a pie menu. I'm still learning, but there are all kinds of different menu items and things we can stem from just from these templates here. So in this example here, how to get this layout demo appearing in our scene area. So if we want to load, for example, UI kind of like this one over here, this layout demo, I'm going to go up to the templates, Python, and in this case, I'll click on UI panel. This is going to load up a simple to complicated script that we can start taking a look at. In this case, the first thing we do in like any Python script inside of Blender is import Blender Python. We're going to import Blender Py because this is going to be useful to gather all of the different required elements so we can access the objects in our scene, we can access the context of our scene and everything like that. If you want to get a basic idea just browsing through these templates where they're going to appear, you can kind of get an idea when you find something that looks like this. Scene underscore PT underscore layout. That means this is going to appear inside of our scene tab, which is right here. And PT is just kind of the type of UI, and it's going to be a layout. So when I click on play on this, it's going to then appear over here in my scene. And here we can kind of reference what these different UI elements look like in comparison to the code up here. So you can see we have a single row, start frame and end frame, aligned row, start frame and end frame. So you can see now inside of our draw function, inside of our actual class here, this class here is to create a new panel. Blender Python, what type of panel or what type of Blender Python thing do we want to make? A panel. So this class here, which is basically a function if you're familiar with JavaScript, contains some basic identifying information like the name of this panel, the ID, which also describes where it's going to appear, the space type, the region type, and the context. The context is kind of just like the active scene or active panel that's open, or what it's going to be applying to basically. But then we have a definition function inside of our class called draw. This is what's actually going to physically create a UI. Now this may not all make 100% sense, but this is the way I learned literally just months ago. What you do is you go into each of these UIs examples and you can kind of extract what information you want to learn out of it. So this is just kind of the way you learn how to build these things. You take a look at this class. We're defining a class which has the name panel, so we're creating a new panel. We're using Blender Python types.panel. We have our definitions and then our actual draw, which is simply just what creates the user interface. Now, one cool thing is this Python console allows us to skim some useful information. So let's say we want to understand what BPY is. We can type in BPY, press the period key, and then under console, autocomplete. This will show us all of the optional properties after this. As you can see, we have types here, so I can say bpy.types, and we actually don't have to put in the period, but if we hit autocomplete, it'll auto put it in for us, and then we have to hit it again. So under all of our types, we have actually a ton of elements, which I can't even scroll through all of them. So sometimes you will actually want to refer to a guide, and we can just Google Blender Python guide, and It's under Python scripting. I'll include the link for this down below, but this will also have a lot of useful information, especially in examples like this where we can't see all of our types appearing here. But as you know, we have this BPY types.panel. So if I wanted to autocomplete the panel, you can see now we have all of the options we can do to our actual panel. We have append, get, driver add, items, keys, pop, remove. So some of these are like default object things you can do, default methods you can do to objects, and some of them are more unique to this panel types. So those are just the basic ways we can kind of navigate the API directly from Blender. And that will just allow us to get a lot of useful information, especially if we don't know what something in particular is, or if we want to know what sub-properties are contained within something, like bpy dot, what is ops? Maybe I want to understand what, is that operations? So I can say bpy dot ops, autocomplete, needs a period, and then these are all of our operator things, which as you can see contains a lot of useful stuff directly related to Blender, everything from view 3D to render, rigid bodies, lattice, pencil, geometry, fonts. So you can kind of use this as an additional guide while you're going through all of the code to quickly understand what's going on. Now back to our defined draw function, which actually creates this UI over here. I'm going to go ahead and take a look at each element one by one. First, the definition of our draw function. Pretty much in any function when we have a UI or things like that in our Blender add-on, we're usually going to give it two arguments, the self and the context. The self is going to refer to the actual user interface itself. So you'll see we use things like self.layouts to get the layout of our whole thing. And we have the context, which for example, if I have a selected item here in my 3D scene, this can be thought of as a context. So we can refer to the context.scene to get basically the whole scene selection of our scene here. And then from there we could say, okay, not just the context.scene, but maybe I want the selected item, or maybe I want the item called light, or maybe I want the item called cube underscore 001. With this scene variable, we can start to get all of that information. But for now, we're just going to focus on creating a relatively simple user interface. The way we're going to do that is first by defining a layout label. This is just going to be a bit of text. And I believe we can even say, like, in our console here, let's see if we can actually get the variable label. In this case, I think we would actually need to console log it instead of just trying to read it. But we have a layout label here, which we're going to set the text to simple row. Then after we've created this simple row kind of header, we can now create these frame start and frame ends. With these, we're going to basically define a new row, so we can just go row by row and create as many rows as we want. And in fact, if I wanted to, I could simply delete all of this here, press the play button to rerun the script, and we can see we just have a few simple elements. So if we wanted to break things down and make them even simpler, that's what we could do. So now that we have these basic elements broken down a little bit here, so we can more simply understand what's going on, why do these two buttons here, which appear down here as start frame and end frame, why do they not have the actual text, you know, start frame and end frame? In fact, if I run this, you can see I'm just going to get one, my frame end. That's because when we use these particular strings, it's kind of like using a match name in Adobe. This is referring to like a pre-existing UI element that Blender has built into it. The frame start in particular and the frame end in particular are predefined elements essentially that when we give it these strings will recreate the elements. There are so many kinds of different UI elements in Blender that some of them are just kind of set as preset ones that we can reuse later. Now, after all that UI creation, we have a register and an unregister function. This is important to register any class or method you define. So in this case, we have a class which creates our UI. If we created a second one, we would want to also register that, whether it's like our test panel. And then in the unregister, we also need to have a one-to-one between our classes that we registered so that we can register them properly when we load up the extension or add-on, and then unregister them when we close it or are done with it. And then lastly, we have if name is equal to main, register. This is essentially our initialization function that starts up everything. If you're familiar with JavaScript, this is the same thing as kind of saying, or if you're familiar with C++ or JavaScript, it's kind of like saying function main or int main. This is going to be the first thing that gets looked at and then executed when we run our add-on. And so that's kind of the basics of going over one of these template Python scripts and understanding what's going on. I can load up an additional one, for example, and look at something more complicated like UI previews dynamic enum. This is essentially a super complicated script which allows you to have image previews inside of your panel. And if I go ahead and look for, you can see here we have our panel defined here under class. You can see we have some other stuff defined, but the main thing is our UI here. We want to look at previews example panel, bpy.types.panel. That's what we want to look for. Where might this appear? Looks like under the object panel here. So if I go ahead and run this, you can see now we have this bit, this previews example panel that appears. It's going to ask for a folder path. We can give it a folder path, and now it's going to load up all of the stuff inside of that folder I selected. So this is a bit more complicated of an example, but you can go through things like this and start to understand how these more complicated scripts, UIs, and functionality work. In this case, you can start off by looking at the UI. We're creating a layout, we're creating a window manager, we're creating some rows, some properties, some template icon views, and we have a whole bunch of other stuff you can go over in all of these pre-templated scripts, and some of them are just functionality where they're just running code, and that's going to be useful for those who want to automate the actual functionality of Blender. Of course, probably everyone's going to want to do that, but the ones that are under UI obviously are going to be helpful for learning UIs, and all of the other ones are going to be super useful for other stuff. There's also the operator section, and these control more, again, templated things inside of Blender, whether the operator, basically a function or an operation you're running, is a file export, file import. If you want to add a mesh, you can see here, we can just add a mesh by running this particular script, and it adds a cube in the middle of our scene. If we wanted to take a quick look at how that works, you can see we have the same register and unregister functions down here. We have our name equals main. And then we have a test call at the very bottom. This is actually the functionality that's adding this cube here. If I comment it out with a character hashtag there, delete this cube here. If I run it, nothing happens. But if I comment it back in, you can see we're going to add a primitive box. And as you can see under here in our class called add-box, the label or the ID name is called mesh.primitiveBoxAdd, which is actually the same exact name we have here. So it's basically running through this code here and executing what is put inside of here to create a new box, or at least with these properties in particular. And then of course you can go in and try other stuff. If I go over to my console, I can type in bpy.ops.mesh.autocomplete, and look at all the stuff we can do to meshes. We have the one we're currently using, which is primitive box add. Let's say we want to add a cone. We can just copy this bit of code here, paste it, and make sure our area is clean here, and run it. And just like that, we've created a cone. We can go through and take a look at all of the detailed code. Maybe, I don't know. This is for, I believe, a UI. You can basically go in and adjust the vertices, faces, and all that if you want to. This is where things start to get really complicated, and the areas that I'm currently in the process of learning. I've mostly dealt with UIs and basic operations, but you can use the Python console in tandem with the script writing section. In tandem with all of this down here, you can see if I wanted the code maybe to add a cylinder, boom, we have the code right here to now add our cylinder with those properties, and when I run it, it's going to add a cylinder. So between these different panels, you can learn a lot and get started in learning Blender add-ons, which will help you in all sorts of ways, whether it's in VFX, 3D, or game development. But that's going to do it, everyone, for this beginner Blender add-on tutorial, just going over the basics of how to set things up, how to view all the properties and start learning things, how to make sense of the templated projects, whether they're UI or useful functionality ones. If you guys enjoyed the video, hit the thumbs up button down below, hit subscribe and the bell icon to be notified of new videos coming out twice weekly on the channel, and down in the description you can follow us on GitHub for coding updates as well as Instagram for other live updates. If you haven't already joined our Discord server, make sure you do to get help with scripting, extensions, plugins, submit tutorial ideas, and much more. And if you'd like to help support us on YouTube, you can become a member or supporter, link down below. That comes with cool perks and helps us out financially. Also check out the links down below to AEscripts, Gumroad, and Adobe Exchange to see some other cool stuff I make. Thanks again for watching, everyone. We'll see you next time.